Okay, hello everyone and welcome back. Uh, how do I, sorry, a few people just came in that I have to let in. Okay, there we go. Welcome back. The topic for this evening is the Jewish minority in medieval Christendom. Last week we spoke about Judaism in Islam. And part of my goal for last week's session was to apologize for having too much focus on Jews in the Christian world and not enough focus on Jews in the Muslim world. So I was trying to compensate that a bit for that last week, and we'll turn back to Jews in the Muslim world at the end of the course. But more of our focus is on Jews in the Christian world, and that's just because I'm more comfortable in that area, and there's always going to be a bias based upon where the person teaching, what that person is, what their orientation is, right? What they know more about. One of the texts I keep referring to, I'm not going to refer it to today after this, but I keep referring to this book by David Nirenberg called Anti-Judaism. He apologizes for not talking about the history of anti-Judaism in Eastern Europe because he doesn't have facility with Slavic languages, whereas he knows German and French and Italian and Arabic. So we had a full, and Spanish, I should say. So it's why he was able to focus on the Muslim story and also on the Jews in Western Europe. Again, I have everyone on mute, but please remember to keep yourselves on mute unless you have a question, just shout it out at that point. So, as I said, we were looking at Jews in the Muslim world last week, and the idea was to see what the roots are of an anti-Jewish tradition in Islamic culture, and seeing that it went back to the beginning. We already spent time looking at the roots of anti-Jewish thinking in the Christian Bible and the Church Fathers. None of that is intended to be a condemnation of Islam or Christianity. Jewish tradition, we also have negative sources about other peoples that the Jews came into contact with as well. And one of the issues of debate on historians that talk about anti-Judaism in the Middle Ages, they say, okay, well, the Christians hated the Jews because they said they blasphemed Jesus, but in fact they did blaspheme Jesus. And there were Jewish writings, that were also very hateful of Christianity and Christians. That's a different story. That's the story of sort of Jewish, it's a self-defense and a response to the pressures of the Christian world. The story that I'm telling here is more the history of the anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism from the outside, which is a reflection of Jews by last week Muslims, and this week we're back to the Christian story. So let me put the screen, the PowerPoint here, and slideshow. Hold on. From the beginning. Okay, so today we're looking at the Jewish minority in medieval Christendom. And again, that one more thing of introduction, that huge book I was referring to last week by Robert Wistritz on the history of anti-Semitism, he's arguing a corrective that historians of anti-Semitism focus too much on Jews in the Christian world, and we need to focus on more on Jews in the Arab world and the Muslim world. So again, with all those apologies said, we turn back to Jews in the Christian world, which is where the Ashkenazim come from. And there are, looking at it here, there are points of conflict that erupt in the Middle Ages. The first huge eruption is the Rhineland massacres in the First Crusade. When Pope Urban calls for a crusade, Christians to go, Western Latin Christians, to go to the Holy Land and fight the Arabs for control of the Christian holy sites, specifically for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Some of the, at least irregular Crusader armies passing through the Rhineland attacked the Jewish communities there, way in advance of their reaching the real target, which was supposed to be the Muslims. And the idea is there's an association in the Christian mind between Jews and Muslims, in that both are they're not pagan, and yet they don't understand that Jesus is the Messiah and Christianity is the true faith. And it's one of the first real explosions of violence against Jews in Christian Europe. We talked about the pogroms in Alexandria, right? And the experience and the violence the Jews experienced in ancient times, the violence that's threatened in the book of Esther that we read about there. That was a thing that Jews lived with. It happened in the end of the 11th century. And one of the reasons why violence was sort of held back in early medieval Europe was because of the teachings of Augustine, who's the most important of the church fathers, and because of that was codified by the popes, that the Jews are a protected minority, or persecuted minority, but they're protected. Now, how do you be persecuted and protected at the same time? Yes, they were discriminated against, but at the same time, the Jews were permitted to persist and to remain as a small minority. And that served, as Augustine spelled it out and the popes codified the position, it served a purpose for Christianity, because Jews were the witnesses to the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish faith that was superseded by Christianity. That truce, it's almost a theological truce, breaks out in 1096. The Jews in the Rhineland, these were the Jewish communities of Worms and Mainz and Speyer and Cologne. They turned to the local bishops and they beg for protection. And the bishops do what they can to help the Jews. But yet there's only so much you can do to a huge military force that is coming in. And we have accounts of the Crusade massacres and from both Hebrew chronicles and Latin chronicles. And the story they tell is that the Jews practiced martyrdom themselves. And it was a mass, there was a self-slaughter, a suicide of the Jews and their families, rather than have to be forced to accept a baptism by the swords of the Crusaders. It sets the Ashkenazic tradition of what's called Kiddush Hashem, which is literally means sanctification of God's name, martyrdom, as in sharp distinction to the experience of the Jews in the Sephardic world under persecution, which is Jews in the Arab Muslim countries and in the previously Muslim countries like Spain, which then became Christian again. There, the Jews tended to accept baptism when they were forced to, but secretly keep their Jewishness, which is the tradition of the conversos. The Ashkenazic, that is the German tradition, is very different. It was to, those that accepted baptism just became Christian, and others accepted martyrdom. And those sources in the story of the Crusader massacres is the basis of the martyrology section that made its way into the Machzor on Yom Kippur, these dirges in the memory of the violent persecution that the Jews were exposed to at the end of the 11th century as a part of the turn to violence that was unleashed with the call for the First Crusade. In 1242, the Talmud, tens of thousands of volumes of Jewish books are collected and burned in public in Paris. Nicholas Donin is a Jew who becomes an apostate, converts to Christianity, and denounces the Talmud to the Pope. And the Pope, this is Pope Innocent III, sends out letters to the bishops and cardinals throughout the realm of the church to investigate the Talmud. And if it was understood to be blasphemous, then he called on kings to destroy the Talmud. The only king that complied was Louis IX. It was called Saint Louis, and the King of France, did collect and burned all the Talmuds. In most other countries, all the other countries, the kings did not follow the Pope's order to burn the Talmud, but the Talmuds and Jewish commentaries and whole libraries were burnt in France. And of course, this is before the time of the printing press. So these are all hand manuscript volumes. When we think about the 13th century burning of the Talmud in Paris, it's hard to imagine that without thinking also of the burning of the library books in Nazi Germany at the beginning of Nazi Reich in the it's called in the Babelplatz in like Berlin, where they threw out it's right in front of the University Library, where they threw into the square any books written by Jewish authors or by communists, or other books that were considered a desecration were burnt in public. That public burning of books goes back to this 13th century precedent. In the late 12th century, and then continues, there are many blood libels, but these are the two most famous blood libels. Norwich, which is in England, and Trent, which is a German-Italian town in the north of Italy. In both cases, the Jews are accused of kidnapping and ritually killing a young Christian boy and using the blood to bake matzah for the celebration of Passover. In both cases, of course, Jews, the whole Jews of the community, many of them were accused, and Jews were tortured and executed, and there were riots against them. And there are many. Norwich, the 1144 is the first famous one, the earliest one. Trent, the one from the 15th century, is widely spread because then we have in the development of printing and the spread of information, and the blood libels spread throughout Eastern Europe and continues even into modern times. The fourth point of conflict explosion is in the end of the 14th century. So we're covering a period here of about 400 years when the Jews are blamed for the Black Plague, for the Black Death. And it exploded to the point where in Strasbourg, Jews in the city were burned in 1349. I can read you a passage here. You don't have it in front of you. The day that the Jews were burnt in public was Valentine's Day, 1349. I'm reading from a text here. They burnt the Jews on a wooden platform in the cemetery. There were about 2,000 people of them. Those who wanted to baptize themselves were spared. Many small children were taken out of the fire and baptized against the will of their fathers and mothers. And everything that was owed to the Jews was canceled. The Jews had to surrender all pledges and notes that they had taken for debts. The council, however, took the cash the Jews possessed, divided it among the working men proportionately. The money was indeed the thing that killed the Jews. If they had been poor and if the feudal lords had not been in debt to them, they would not have been burnt. So it's saying that they were burnt because of anger for poisoning the wells was the calumny against Jews. But the author of this text is saying it was really because of the hatred, because of the debts that were owed Jews. And finally, he points out it was decided in Strasbourg that no Jews should enter the city for 100 years, but after 20 years, the council arrests themselves and allow Jews to come back in. So that's I add that just a sense that I'm not going to talk today about the expulsions, because the expulsions of Jews were tied into the economic story. But I wanted to bring that up, that hatred of the Jews based on the Jews' role as lenders, and hated for the interest. And usury is, of course, a bad word for interest that was charged. And that's somehow mixed in with this blaming of the Jews for the cause of the Black Plague. It is, of course, particularly meaningful for us today as we're living in the midst of a pandemic. And I think all of us have heard of different groups have been blamed for causing the pandemic. And that's something to be mindful of. That is an old story, especially for the majority to blame a minority because of their frustration over an epidemic. and to inflict harm and violence on the minority. These are 4 points of conflict, of violent conflicts that explode within the context of medieval Christian Europe. Now, let me go to the next slide here. There were these are two Christian thinkers, two theologians backing up to 1096, which are the violence in the Crusades. And these are in the aftermath of 1096. Bernard of Clairvaux is the saint of the Second Crusade. Right? You see, he lives to 1153. And he wrote letters all through Europe to try to raise a Christian army to go fight a Second Crusade. And I could have quoted a lot of things. This one sentence is key. It says, "We are told by the apostle," that is Paul, "that when the time is ripe, all Israel will be saved." He was aware of the violence against Jews in Germany that happened in the First Crusade. By the way, let me back up here for a second. This is all through Europe. The Rhineland massacres is Germany. Burning of the Talmud is France. The blood libels is England and Italy. And then Strasbourg is on the border between France and Germany. So you can see how it's spread out over the areas that's we know as Catholic Europe. So Bernard knows that violence erupted against the Jews. And while he's calling for the Second Crusade, he wants to learn the lessons of what went wrong in the First Crusade. And he says, don't attack the Jews. The Jews are supposed to be able to live and they will convert in the end of time. Bernard Clairvaux was a friend of the Jews. Peter the Venerable was not. And Peter the Venerable, they're contemporaries. They're living at the same, it's basically same age. And this is one quotation from Peter the Venerable. There are many, many others I could have chosen. He writes, "By what value in pursuing and attacking the enemies of the Christian faith in remote and distant lands, while the Jews, wretched blasphemers, far worse than the Saracens," Saracens are Muslims, "not far away, but in our midst, so freely and audaciously blaspheme, abuse, and trample on Christ and the Christian sacraments with impunity? In what way does the zeal for God consume the sons of God, if the Jews, the worst enemy of Christ and Christians, thus escape utterly unaffected?" Peter the Venerable is saying exactly the opposite of Bernard Clairvaux. He's saying, yes, we should fight the Crusades, fight the Muslims, but before we worry about the Muslims, let's deal with the Jews, because the Jews are much worse than the Muslims. The Jews are the ones who blaspheme, who abuse, and who fail to accept Jesus. And behind that is the charge of deicide, that the Jews are responsible for Jesus' death. So I wanted these two sort of more theological, educated voices. One is, I don't know, you call Bernard maybe philo-Semitic, one is anti-Semitic. And then I want to look now at developments that are now codified into church law. And then we're going to see how this all comes together. The most important event in Christian history in the beginning of the 13th century, in this period of, we call the High Middle Ages, is the Fourth Lateran Council. It's a church council that meets in the Lateran Palace in Rome in 1215. And there were 69 canons that were voted on. And I'm going to go through the ones at the end that relate to Jews. Canon 67 is on usury. And I talked before, we saw how even the Jews are burned for the Black Plague in the 14th century. That part of the hatred was based in money lending. The more the Christians are restrained from the practice of usury, this is a quotation from the Lateran Council, the more they are oppressed in this matter by the treachery of the Jews, so that in short time they exhaust the resources of the Christians. Right? So there's sort of an acknowledgement that the more that we prevent Christians from money lending, the more Jews are going to money lend, and then we're going to be oppressed by the Jews. So this is because there is a line in the Bible, right, that you don't charge usury, which is understood as interest. So Jews aren't supposed to charge interest. It's understood to your fellow. So a Jew can't charge interest to a Jew. A Christian is not supposed to charge interest to a Christian. And this is because this is the pre-industrial society where you lend someone money. You're supposed to lend someone money as an act of charity, as tzedakah, right? To help them out. You're not lending money because cash is not considered a commodity the way that we understand it today. So if Christians weren't allowed to lend to Christians, then Jews lent to Christians, and then Jews were hated, but people did need to borrow money. And in other classes, I've talked about the economics of that. I don't want to focus so much on this class, but let's read what the Lateran Council says about this. So, wishing therefore in this matter to protect Christians against cruel oppression by the Jews, we ordain in this decree that if in the future, under any pretext, Jews extort from Christians oppressive and immoderate interest, the partnership of the Christians will be denied them till they have made suitable satisfaction for their excesses. So this is actually very pragmatic. Yes, they're calling Jews cruel, is an official church statement, but they're saying that the decree is that Jews can't charge Christians oppressive and immoderate interest, which means if it's reasonable interest, Jews are allowed to do. Otherwise, why would they lend money, right? So there's a pragmatism mixed in here with the hierarchical division of society. The Christians also, every appeal being set aside, shall if necessary be compelled by ecclesiastical censure to abstain from all commercial intercourse with them, right? Meaning if a Jew is considered to be usurious, right, too oppressive, then you're not allowed to do business with them. We command the princes not to be hostile to the Christians on this account, but rather to strive to hinder the Jews from practicing such excesses. Lastly, we decree that the Jews be compelled by the same punishment to make satisfaction for the tithes and offerings to the churches, which the Christians were accustomed to supply from their houses and other possessions before these properties, under whatever title, fell into the hands of the Jews, that thus the churches may be safeguarded against loss. So us is saying to the Jews, by the way, even if the interest that you're charging is not oppressive or immodest, nevertheless, you can't seize from the Christians something that they're donating to the church. The church needs to be protected. Church gets paid first. Then whatever's left, the Jews could seize if a Christian is forfeiting their debt. So that's canon 67. Now let's look at the next canon, the next decree of the council, number 68, which is on distinctive dress. This is that there are some rules on this in individual areas, but this is the first European-wide rule that how did the Jews get the money to lend to the Christians? It's how does any bank lend money? You know, you save up, you borrow from other banks, Jews lend to other Jews, and then when the capital gets to build up, Jews were focused on money lending because there were only certain areas of the economy that were open to them. In general, Jews could not be landowners. So I'm just going back to the usury one here. So they not, of course, we shouldn't imagine that all Jews were wealthy. Most Jews were not wealthy, but there were some who accumulated capital through the business of lending. How you go into business today? You might borrow from everyone in your family and all your cousins, open a bank, and then once you get your first loan in, then you start making profit because you collect with the interest collects aren't in it. So people think, oh, this guy's going to be a good banker, or I'm going to invest in his bank. And that's how they developed the money there. The basic theory for expulsion of Jews that I'm still hold is that although Spain's a little more complicated, but a lot of the places where Jews were expelled, it's because the debts were too high. So the state, when it didn't need the money, it decided, let me default on my loan. That's better than having to pay all the Jews. Yeah, it means the Jews aren't going to be there for me to borrow money from them. But there are certain times that you need to borrow money, and there's other times that I don't need to borrow money anymore. Now I have to worry about paying my debts. So you weigh those things. Okay, let me see, there's another comment there. The difference between interest and usury. The difference is usury is interest that is oppressive. So it's right, that's the only difference. It's a negative valence to it. Rebate is the Hebrew term, and the Hebrew term is not doesn't have the same valence. But in English, when we say usurious means taking advantage and charging too much interest. It's like if the credit card decides to charge me a APR of 60%. that would be usurious in a sense. That would be usury. Okay, so let's go to Canon 68 here, which is on distinctive dress. In some provinces, a difference in dress distinguishes the Jews of Saracens from the Christians. Saracens are Muslims, but in certain others, such a confusion has grown up that they cannot be distinguished by any difference. Thus, it happens at times that through error, Christians have relations with the women of Jews or Saracens, and Jews and Saracens with Christian women, therefore that they may not, under pretext of error of this sort, excuse themselves in the future for the excesses of such prohibited intercourse. We decree that such Jews and Saracens of both sexes in every Christian province and at all times shall be marked off in the eyes of the public from other people through the character of their dress. So again, this is the rule that Jews have to have a distinctive dress, and Muslims, to distinguish them from Christians. So they had to be visually that they couldn't pass as Christians. The concern there is romantic relations, but it serves a greater purpose of setting the minority aside. And you'll see the note, the last paragraph, during the last 3 days before Easter, and especially on Good Friday, they, meaning Jews and Muslims, shall not go forth in public at all. Because they're going to go out, they're going to be better dressed, they're going to mock the Christians, and this is our holy week when we wear signs of mourning. Okay, we're still not under the Pope's influence. Russia, Turkey. Well, Turkey is a part of the Muslim world, right? So Turkey is different. The only, I guess, Turkey and that's Greece and Bulgaria is a part of the Muslim part. Granada is still Muslim until in the 15th century, it's conquered by the Spanish monarchs in Spain. The Pope is very influential, and actually, I'm sorry, in Eastern, it depends on the time period, right? In this period, the Turkey and Greece is still Christian, it's Orthodox. But when it's conquered by the Muslims, there's still many Orthodox Christians who live there. The area of influence of the Pope is Latin Christendom, which was the original, the Western Roman Empire, as opposed to the Eastern Roman Empire. So it's the countries that we saw those eruptions of violence in. It's Italy, Germany, France, England. Those are the Latin countries. Okay, so what's interesting here is that if you remember one of the early classes, I was talking about the papyri from Elephantine Island in Egypt, where the Persian government had given instructions not to bother the Jews in the time before Passover. There wasn't an Easter then, but there was the sense there was that time of the year, there would be an increase in hatred against Jews. The same thing here. I wonder whether there is an element of protection of Jews and Muslims, that they better just stay home and not go outside on Good Friday, because otherwise violence could erupt. So there's in the context of these eruptions of violence in the medieval world, that the church is trying to legislate to maintain the peace and maintain the hierarchical distinctions between Muslims, Jews as the minority, and Christians as the majority. Was the Pope in control everywhere? No, of course not. The Pope had to appeal to the kings and the princes and the lands, but the church edicts are very influential, and we could look at the laws in the individual countries, but they're all influenced by the church decrees, which represent basically all of Latin Christendom, right? The world of the Catholic Church. Let's go to the next, and this is the last canon here, 69, the denial of public office to Jews. Since it is absurd that a blasphemer of Christ, that's a theological term for a Jew, right, exercise authority over Christians, we, on account of the boldness of the transgressors, prohibit Jews from being given preference in the matters of public office, since in such capacity they're most troublesome to the Christians, meaning that Jews cannot be given a public office where they have authority over Christians. And and then it gives details that no one should help the Jew and the Jew needs to be removed from the office. The same rule, by the way, appeals to pagans as well. It's not just Jews, but they don't want Jews to have public office. So we've kind of covered this as the four big examples of violent eruption of violence against Jews, and also the position of the church. The four Lateran councils are the most important church councils, and we saw a few different, 67, 68, and 69 are decrees against Jews, controlling Jewish money lending, controlling Jewish dress, and controlling the power position of Jews, that they don't rise to position of power over Christians. So they can't be town councilors, they can't be mayors, they can't be police officers. Those things Jews can't do, when they can't ever have authority over Christians. So the question now is, what is this anti-Semitism? How is this developing? And is it different from what we've seen before? The most sophisticated and interesting theory about this is by the medieval historian Gavin Langmuir, who I mentioned before. He taught at Stanford, and he is an Anglican, originally from Canada, not Jewish. And everyone who discusses the history of anti-Semitism, at least in the Middle Ages, cannot do so without talking about Langmuir. And Langmuir is looking at the question of what are the continuities between the anti-Jewish violence in the Middle Ages, going backwards to the Jewish position about Jews that go from the beginning of Christianity that we've looked at, and going forward the line from there to the catastrophe of the Shoah, the Holocaust. So I want to spend some time really discussing what is Gavin Langmuir's theory and how it applies to those explosions of violence and hatred that took place in the Middle Ages. So to understand his theory, he has these, he makes a distinction between rational, non-rational, and irrational thought. So these are three types of thought according to Langmuir. And we understand rational is based on empirical thinking, right? What is I'm looking at the evidence, and I believe something because I have evidence for it. And non-rational is but what's the difference between non-rational and irrational? I had to really read through his whole book and keep davening through this to understand the point that he's trying to make. But for Langmuir, there is a very sharp distinction between non-rational and irrational. Non-rational is, unlike rational, I believe in something without empirical evidence. I uncritically believe in something, but it's still plausible. It's not devoid from reality, whereas irrational is devoid from reality. That irrational is where it is dangerous, because it's a belief in something where all evidence points to the contrary. Non-rational is just, I just don't see the evidence. Irrational is, I disregard the evidence, right? So there was a lot of talk about the difference between non-rational and irrational, and still is, as we reflect on the events of, January 6th, and what was the evidence or non-evidence over the national election in our country, right? And a lot of talk about where is, have we reached an irrational point where we don't consider evidence, so we believe in things with evidence to the contrary? Or is it rational, like there's evidence, it depends on what evidence that you look for? Or is it non-rational, meaning I don't have the evidence, but I believe it because it's plausible? So these are three distinct categories, according to Langmuir. And Langmuir argues that every mentally healthy person has a mixture of rational and non-rational thought, right? That we can't just believe in rational thought, because there are certain things that we just don't have evidence for that we have to go with. But when the non-rational becomes irrational is when things can become dangerous. And we're going to see how he what the difference is in the history of anti-Semitism. This is a history of sort of how humanity works in general, and then he applies it to the history of anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages. And it goes to about what is the difference between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. So this is his definition here. And by the way, he's really very, very focused on this idea of definitions. One of his collection of essays is called Towards a Definition of Anti-Semitism. So this is his definition. Anti-Judaism is a non-rational reaction to overcome non-rational doubts, while anti-Semitism is an irrational reaction to repressed rational doubts. And that can get you a little dizzy. So let me just try to unpack it here. Saying anti-Judaism, which is what starts in the beginnings of Christianity and the ancient, and before that, is a non-rational reaction, right? It's not, I hate Jews, the practitioner of anti-Judaism, not for rational reasons. The things that I hate Jews for are not things that I've necessarily had evidence that they do, but it's plausible that Jews do those things. But my doubts, it's fed by doubt, right? Everything's about doubt. It's a reaction to the doubt. I have a non-rational doubt about something, so I non-rationally blame the Jews. While anti-Semitism is an irrational reaction to repressed rational doubts. See, and that's where the shift is. That anti-Semitism is irrational. It's worse than non-rational. It's irrational. It's based upon assumptions about Jews that have absolutely no evidence, but it's because I'm repressing a doubt of something that's a rational doubt, meaning my rational side is saying, how can I believe this about my identity? So because I'm in doubt, I'm going to, rather than embrace the doubt and critique my identity, instead I'm going to turn to an irrational hatred against Jews. That's his theory of why anti-Semitism develops. We're going to break it down. This is just the theory level, and we're going to see how it applies to the events that we talked about in the first half of this evening. Okay? Jews, and these slides here are quotations from Langmuir. Jews were thus the very incarnation of disbelief in Jesus, right? From the Christian perspective, Jews are the incarnation. They are the embodiment of not believing in Jesus, the opposite of what Christians are supposed to be. And there are three main non-rational reactions that stand out. Number one, the belief in the deficiency of Jewish understanding, that Jews don't understand the truth about the world, meaning that Jesus is the Christ. Two, the Deicide accusation that Jews are responsible for the crucifixion, for the death of Jesus. And three, the belief that historical events demonstrated that God was punishing the Jews for their deicide. And I talked about this 2 sessions ago when we looked at the church fathers. It was Eusebius who did the most of this, saying that the subsequent destruction of the temple by the Romans, right, the generation after Jesus, proves that Jesus was the true savior, because the Jews are punished with the loss of their temple. Now, we're going to look at these three things closer and then see how Langmuir sees the shift from non-rational to irrational, from non-rational anti-Judaism to irrational anti-Semitism. But the interesting thing about his theory that not everyone accepts is that it's really rooted in a theological understanding that people living in Christendom are Christians, right? And it has to do with Christianity. So this is a very sort of understanding of the role of religion in history as critical. And because he's a medievalist, his argument is that Christianity was the most important thing in Christian Europe. And that there are many other approaches that, no, it's about economics, no, it's about minority and majority. He's saying, no, it really is about religion. So we're going to break down these three things here and see how they play out. Number one, belief in the deficiency of Jewish understanding. Again, these are excerpts from Langmuir's book that I'm reading, that I typed out here for you. So Christians gradually reinterpreted Hebrew scriptures in the past of Jews in accordance with their own non-rational beliefs in a way that anyone who does not share Christian beliefs must consider a distortion. All right, let's look at the Hebrew Bible, right? Christians say, oh, Jews don't understand the Hebrew Bible. But Christians are reading the Bible as all the Hebrew Bible as the Old Testament that's leading into the New Testament. So there's all these prefigurations that when Abraham brings Isaac to sacrifice Isaac in the Akedah, the Rosh Hashanah Torah reading, that's really prefiguring the crucifixion, because Isaac has to carry the wood up, that's Jesus carrying the cross. When Moses raises his arms in the battle against the Amalekites, and Aaron and Hur on each side of Moses are holding up his arm, Moses is making the sign of the cross, which prefigures the cross as the sign of the salvation. When and I could go on and on and on with examples there. And the Christian argument is that's what the Bible means, and the Jews are not understanding it properly. But he says here that the point. This is I read that it's not. It's a non-rational belief about what the Bible means. The same thing about Jewish history. The fact that the reason why the Romans destroyed Jerusalem is because the Jews failed to accept Jesus as the Messiah. That's a very Christian theological reading of history, but you would not believe that unless you were Christian. So if you're not Christian, if you don't share Christian beliefs, you must consider their reading of the Bible and their reading of history as a distortion. And Lagmer writes, as we would expect a contemporary professor to say, who's trained in critical thinking, that even though some literary scholars assert that a text has no fixed meaning, or that we cannot know what it meant, right? The poem means whatever I want it to read. That's like postmodernism, and the idea that there is no set meaning for the poem. It's whatever we want the poem to say. It means it's determined. The meaning is determined by the reader, not by the author. There's no fixed meaning, but we cannot know what it meant to those who composed it. It's impossible to get into the minds of the author. Nevertheless, all that being said, Lagmer says, we can be sure that whatever the Hebrew scriptures meant to those who composed them, they did not mean what Christians who lived much later and whose religiosity had developed under very different conditions said they had meant, right? Whatever the Bible says, and whether or not we can know what the Bible meant, we know it doesn't mean what Christians say it means. Nor had the Jews done what Christians said they had done, right? And then the next paragraph, the Christian understanding of Jewish history is a perfect example of the failure to distinguish between non-rational and rational empirical thinking, but it was not irrational, right? He's saying that the Christian reading of Jewish history and the Bible is non-rational. It's not based on evidence. It's not based on critical criticism, right? The way that what can you prove through the text, through the evidence, through the historical context. If it were, it would be rational, empirical, right? Now it's non-rational. But just because it's non-rational doesn't mean it's irrational, right? Meaning it is plausible that the Bible, the intent is what they're saying. It is plausible that is why the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, because Christianity is true. I don't believe it's true, but Lagmer doesn't believe, although he is Anglican, he's saying from a critical perspective, we don't believe it's true. But since Christians believe that, it's not irrational. It doesn't make them irrational to believe in their religion, right? Even though it's non-rational. Again, maybe it's splitting hairs there, but give it a little more patience and let's see where he goes with it. Jews were thus I went the wrong direction. Okay, number 2, the Deicide accusation, right? That Jews are responsible for killing Jesus. The Jews are called Christ killers, right? So he writes, the Deicide accusation camouflaged Christian awareness that the continued existence of Jewish belief challenged Christian belief, right? That the reason why they're accusing Jews of killing Jesus is because the fact that Jews don't believe in Jesus is a challenge to Christian belief, right? When Christians say, I don't understand why Jews can't accept Jesus. Well, maybe it's because Jesus really wasn't Christ. They can't even process that, but that's why the existence of Jews are a challenge. So the accusation enabled Christians to repress doubts about Jesus' resurrection. So this is he sees this psychological interpretation, right, of Christian society, that there are doubts. Was Jesus resurrected? Well, I don't know. I've never seen anyone come back from the dead. So it's not really rational to believe that Jesus was resurrected. But if Jesus is God's son, God incarnate on earth, then I guess it's possible. That's what the whole point of the miracle of resurrection is. But yet Christians would have doubts about that. So they're repressing those doubts by imagining that no one who was not blind could have encountered Jesus without perceiving that he was God. So that's how I repress the doubt and say that unless you're blind, it should be obvious that because everyone, the believers saw, and that's what we believe to be true. So Jews are blind, and not only are they blind, they're not simply blind, but they're malevolent because they're so stubborn in their blasphemy and their denial of the truth of Jesus, and their malevolence that actually makes them responsible for Jesus' death. Of course, they know that it's the Romans who do the crucifixion, but the Jews condemn Jesus because they don't believe in Jesus. And that's why, in a sense, that's why they're responsible for the execution of Jesus. Now, how does this play out in 1096? Because 1096 is the eruption of violence, right, in the Crusades, the attack on the Jewish communities in the Rhineland, Germany. So he writes, the suicides and massacres of 1096 were horrible, right? That's the source of the martyrology, as I said in the Yom Kippur Matzah. Yet it is difficult to characterize the killers as irrational, though some may have been. See, here's where he's applying his theory here, and you either buy it or you don't. He says if they hated Jews, that is the Crusaders, because of doubts about the value of their identity, their own identity, and they killed Jews to stifle those doubts, they were nonetheless correct in thinking that Jews did not believe in Christ and mocked those who believed in the hanged one, right? It's non-rational, but it's not, right? They weren't irrational in believing that Jews denied Jesus. The Jews did deny Jesus, right? And some Jews even mocked Jesus as the hanged one, which is a reference to Haman from the book of Esther. Moreover, the killers did not project on Jews any characteristics Jews did not have, such as horns. Right? That develops later, this idea of the Jews being devilish with horns and magicians and sorcerers. Those happen later, not in the 11th century. In 1096, the only thing that the Jews were accused of in 1096 was not accepting Jesus, not accepting the belief, right? So they killed Jews, the Crusaders, because they were Jews. Because Jews were people in the midst of Christendom who stubbornly rejected the non-rational beliefs of Christianity and persisted in adhering to their Judaic religion even to the point of martyrdom. And that's why they killed them. They killed them because the Jews were willing to kill themselves to accept martyrdom rather than be baptized. That means they so strongly do not believe what I, from the Crusaders' perspective, the Christians so strongly believe, so that's just intolerable. And that's why it explodes in violence. Someone had mentioned to me after last class, am I focusing too much on the writings of thinkers rather than what happened, in society? But so much, we know what happened. We want to know why it happened. Right. And what Lagmer is trying to do is trying to get into the psychology of these Crusaders. And he's saying that the religion is important. The Crusaders are warriors of the cross. They're wearing the cross on their, and that's what they're going to fight. They're going on a crusade because they believe that doing so will save their souls. Now, not all of them. Some went because they got their debts, as they had a forgiveness of debts. Some went because it was an adventure. But what Langmuir is arguing is that the theology is important and it makes its way into the consciousness. But this is an eruption of violence, but it's not irrational. It's not as bad as it gets worse. The third and the final point was the demonstration of Jews in history, right? That history proves that, that Judaism was wrong, Christianity was right. So this is citing here from Pope Innocent I think that was Innocent the Third, not Innocent the Second, because he's the Pope in the 1200s. It is Pope Innocent the Third. So pretend it's, Pretend it says Pope Innocent III. So Pope Innocent III writes, and this is 1208. So it's 3 years after the Lateran Council. This is the same Pope. Thus the Jews against whom the blood of Jesus Christ calls out, although they ought not to be killed, lest the people forget the divine law, right? So he's accepting the formal, the Augustinian theology, right? That the Jews are tolerated because they're witnesses to the law. Yet as wanderers, they ought to remain upon the earth. And that's what Augustine wrote. They're like Cain, who wanders with the mark of Cain, until their countenance be filled with shame and they seek the name of Jesus Christ the Lord. That is why blasphemers of the Christian name ought not, should be a T there, not to be aided by Christian princes to oppress the servants of the Lord, but ought rather to be forced into the servitude of which they made themselves deserving when they raised their sacrilegious hands against him who had come to confer true liberty upon them, meaning Jesus, thus calling down his blood upon themselves and upon their children. And that's referring to that notorious line in the Gospel of Matthew, when the Jews at the crucifixion say his blood upon us and upon our children, meaning they accept the responsibility. And here you can see, again, it's the argument for tolerance, but that these people are to be hated and are to be wanderers because they're and they should be oppressed. And that it's forcing the history, right? So the idea is that history proves the superiority of Christianity over Judaism, and that's why Christians have to oppress Jews, because that way history will continue to prove the proof of Christianity. Now, what happens with the burning of the Talmud? And this was the second eruption of violence that I laid out at the beginning of the class, right? So what happened with the burning of the Talmud is that Nicholas Donin, who was, as I said, this apostate, reveals to the Pope and this is Gregory the Ninth, who's after Innocent III, and this is, I could read you from the text. Lagmer is so articulate in how he presents it. So I'm just going to read you Lagmer's explanation of why the Talmud is burnt. The only time the authorities tried to deny Jews their religion, right, when they didn't tolerate Judaism, was when they feared it could no longer serve to confirm Christian belief. They discovered the existence of the Talmudic Judaic religion and were shocked. As the Pope put it, the Jews were now using a huge book, the Talmud, not the Bible, as their fundamental divine revelation. Of course, Christians had been interpreting their own Bible for centuries. Christian theologians had written many and massive commentaries. And for centuries, the authorities of the Catholic Church had been prescribing how Catholics were to understand the Bible, right? That's all the things that Talmud does, right? It's not, Christianity wasn't frozen in the New Testament. They have huge commentaries and huge interpretations. But the idea that the Jews were doing the same thing, and they never really paid attention because the Christians couldn't read Hebrew until a Jewish apostate exposes what the Talmud is, yet somehow oblivious to all that, the Pope blamed Jews for putting their own interpretation on their Bible, and he commanded that all copies of the Talmud and the commentaries on it be burned. Jews had to conform, I'm missing an N there, sorry, to the image of Christians, image Christians had made of them, and practice what Christians told them was their religion, right? So the idea here is that Christians, that if Talmudic Judaism is not that if the Jews are practicing Talmudic Judaism, then they're not just witness to the Hebrew scriptures. The whole purpose of tolerating Jews is so that they're librarians. They're librarians who preserve the text. But if they're interpreting it and expanding it as a living tradition, then what good is that to us? So it's here where that Augustinian sort of compromise with why Jews are tolerated breaks down when they start to actually learn something about the Talmud. What I think is so interesting about this is that we usually say that interfaith dialogue, right? We got to learn about each other and then we'll learn to understand. And that is true today. But ironically, then in the 14th century, the opposite happened, that the more the church learned about the Jews, the less tolerant that they became. And that, what Langmuir is saying is because of the insecurity of the belief in the Christian view of history, right? If you have to say that my view supersedes, is superior to everyone else's, then I can't handle a challenge to that. And that's why the Pope ordered the burning of the Talmud. I'm going to speed up here, Beard, since I'm aware that the hour's almost done. We're squeezing a lot into the 1 hour. So going back to the transition from anti-Judaism to anti-Semitism, this is the key line. And when I read this in my book, I double underlined it and put exclamation points in the margin, when you say like, this is the paragraph that says it. He says, if anti-Semitism is defined as chimerical beliefs or fantasies about Jews, he argues this in a different place. He says that anti-Semitism is, right, these are irrational beliefs about Jews. It's like a chimera, an imaginary monster, a fantasy, right? I believe in fantasies like Jews are devils with horns, like Jews kill Christian boys to take their blood to make matzah, right? This is a monstrous belief that has no basis in reality. It's an irrational belief. So if anti-Semitism is defined as the chimerical beliefs and fantasies about Jews as irrational beliefs that attribute to all those symbolized as Jews, which is a symbol of the other in Christianity, menacing characteristics or conduct that no Jews have ever been observed to possess or engage in, and anti-Semitism first appeared in medieval Europe in the 12th century. And that's when it starts. Okay, this is actually taken from, is about the blood libel, the Trent in the 15th century. But this is the most famous picture of a blood libel, that in the secret room in the synagogue, in the preparation for Passover, the Jews have to get a Christian boy and they bleed him for his blood, and they collect his blood. Yes, so saying what is the blood libel symbolize, right? Why is it? Well, it's the young boy is like a Jesus figure himself, right? He's being held here in the shape of the cross. He's being pierced the way Jesus is pierced on the cross. His blood is holy, and the Jews are going to use it for the matzah, which is the ritual meal, in the same way that Christians consume the blood of Jesus in the Eucharist. But this is the anti-Eucharist, right? It's the anti-Christianity. It's the sort of the mirror, the satanic evil mirror image that buttresses the faith of Christian ritual in the church. And this is, again, goes to Langmuir's interpretation. I'll go back to some of these images when we do Christian anti-Jewish iconography. But the other thing that Langmuir points out, and this is his original idea, he says why, the first is in the late 12th century and in the 13th century, 12th, 3rd century, that anti-Judaism becomes anti-Semitism, that you have a blood libel that's a horse of a whole different color, even worse than the Crusade massacres, because it's completely irrational, right? And he says it's because of not just because of, but you can look at the Fourth Lateran Council, because I looked at Canon 67, 68, 69 about the Jews, but the first canon is the canon on transubstantiation. And there is one universal church of the faithful outside of which there is absolutely no salvation, in which there is the same priest and sacrifice, Jesus Christ, whose blood and body are truly contained in the sacrament of the altar under the forms of bread and wine. Now, before I read on, what the Fourth Lateran Council established is that the Eucharist should be a part of the standard Catholic ritual for everyone, that people start getting the Eucharist and that confirmation, and they have to go at least once a year to receive the communion at Mass. They have to confess first, become pure, and receive the communion. It standardizes that. It authorizes the priest, that only ordained priests can do it. And what does it symbolize? That Christ's body and blood are truly contained in the sacrament of the altar and the forms of the bread and the wine, the bread being changed, transubstantiatio, that's transubstantiation, right? That's the Catholic belief that by divine power, the bread in the body is transferred. It becomes the substance of the body and the blood of Jesus. So that to realize the mystery of unity, we may receive of him what he has received of us. And this sacrament no one can effect except the priest who has been truly ordained in accordance with the keys of the church, which Jesus Christ himself gave to the apostles and their successors. So what Langmuir is saying is it can't be a coincidence that right at the time that the blood libel starts, this idea that Jews need Christian blood is the same time that the church is standardizing the doctrine that you have to believe that when the priest raises the wine, the chalice, that becomes Jesus's blood, and when the priest holds out the wafer, that becomes the body of Christ. And he says that maybe some Christians were doubtful about that, and that challenged their identity. And some could live with the doubt, but others could not. So what happened? So this is how he pulls it together. And Sarge, give me a few more minutes. We're almost finished here, and I'll take any questions. By the late Middle Ages, in order to dispel doubts about their religion and themselves, many Christians were suppressing their capacity for rational empirical thought and irrationally attributing to the realities they denoted as Jews unobservable characteristics. The conspiracy was imaginary, right? The Jewish conspiracy, like let's think the blood libel. But the fear and hatred of the image engendered were all too real. Indeed, the hatred was peculiarly intense because what these Christians feared was buried deep within themselves. They feared and hated their own doubts about beliefs basic to their sense of their identity, doubts they could neither acknowledge consciously nor eradicate subconsciously. They hated Jews, it should be emphasized, not because of the Jews, but because they were Christians, right? And this is the point that anti-Semitism is really about Christianity, which is why it's complicated to talk about anti-Semitism in the Muslim world, but we're just looking at it in the Christian context here. They created and believed chimerical fantasies about Jews because Christian symbols, including Jew, which is a Christian symbol, right, of the other, of the non-Christian, were salient in their religiosity, and they wanted to preserve their faith in Christ. And so, by the later Middle Ages, it had become very difficult for many not to believe the fantasies, right, that Jews wanted to kill Christians, particularly the less educated Christians. It became harder, particularly for the less educated, to believe this. Consequently, many Christians were willing to participate in the killing of thousands of Jews for actions that no Jew had ever been observed to commit. In these attacks, we can see for the first time in European history a clear parallel to Hitler's delusions and the victims of the camps. And here he makes the line there, and because the other argument he makes is that Nazism is a kind of a religion, right? That religion doesn't have to be based on a theological belief in God. A religion is based upon certain ideas that form your identity. And for Christian medieval Europe, that was Christianity. And when they doubted that identity, and they doubted their role, they turned on the Jews because they're suppressing their own doubt that they otherwise don't know how to handle. And he's saying here there's a clear parallel to what happens in Nazi Europe. So that we've spent an hour here. We've covered a lot of time. Are there any questions I can answer or any reactions before we close for the night? Go ahead, Ira, just unmute yourself.
Okay, well, we're talking about official Christendom. But if we go back to the 4th century, for St. John Chrysostom, he's already saying something that was already there for a long period of time, that we don't not only just think about the theology of Jesus, the God, but we think of the underworld, of the demons. And St. John was saying that the Jewish mind is complete with demonology. And that was to continue through the local priesthoods, because local priesthoods, basically, they couldn't read very much. They were basically illiterate. And they were telling Bubba Mises. It was conspiracy theories. And so for thousands of years, Jews were the devil incarnate. It was in their souls. And so you were doing a good thing by destroying the Jews because you were destroying the demons. That's another part of anti-Semitism.
Yes, and absolutely. And there was one, and I don't remember the passage from John Chrysostom that we looked at when we did the Church Fathers, had mentioned demons, but of the Church Fathers, he's the one filled with the most venom against Jews. So I guess the question here we're looking at is, as hateful as there are, you can find, right? There are statements from the Church Fathers, and I did find them, right, that are very filled with hatred about Jews and this demonology that spreads here. I guess what Gavin Langner is pointing on is that at what point does that transition from hated discourse to violent actions and attacking again, huge violence? And why do masses of people start believing in these fantasies and killing other Jews? Because you don't have those, and maybe you do. I mean, that's what it's trying to say. When does the shift happen? Maybe there wasn't a shift. Maybe it was always a dangerous world for Jews to live in. And other historians tell the story that way, that the Jews were, dealing with hatred from the beginning. The argument here is that something shifts. As I said, the majority of historians of anti-Semitism don't buy his argument, but I wanted to spend time on it because it's the most sophisticated explanation of sort of what's happening in the Middle Ages, and an argument for why religion, brings religion back into the discussion, and also the idea that not just that what are the elite thinkers thinking, but what are the common people thinking, and try to get into the mind the common people. But there's a lot of assumptions there. And yes, you have the demonology and the hatred and the attacks against Jews from the very beginning. Bob Dworkin.
It absolutely boggles my mind that kind of irrational thought persists to this very day. Just take a look at the QAnon theorists and all of the insanity that they believe in.
But that's where, right, and that's why Langner's theory is useful and almost consoling to read, because when we encounter hatred, where is this coming from? I could look at John Chrysostom and saying, what's going on? Why does he see the Jews as demons? And then, we're talking about John Chrysostom there. But if we talk about people as a whole, like, how can people be filled with such hatred without any justification, without any evidence? So Langner's argument is because it's driven from insecurity, from doubt that they're repressing, right? That they're and that rather than, and it's much harder. It's much harder to look at yourself and be critical and question what makes up your identity. So it's easier to just have someone that you can hate and turn that hatred against someone else. And because the Jews are the antithesis of the Christian in medieval Christendom, that's why they were the obvious. That's why the Jews were in the wrong place at the wrong time, in a sense. But thanks for bringing that up. Exactly. And that's the way that we're going to look at what we're going to look at anti-Semitism as it develops in the 19th and 20th centuries, right? Where it's basically a reaction against industrialization and modernization. It's a reaction against the liberalism. It's people who, and we see this also with contemporary issues, right? Where there's this insecurity in what the premises are of living in the modern world. And that I refuse to accept that, and if you refuse to accept it, rather than you just turn to hatred, and the hatred hides what would otherwise be self-doubt and critical thinking. And and I think that's a comforting way to understand why things happen, and then how we work with that. Oh. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. We're going to take a couple weeks off. I'm away next week, and the week after is the vacation time. So let me just confirm in here, because I have the calendar in front of me. Our next session is on Monday, March 14th. It's on March 4th. March 14th. The 6th, no, the 6th is a Sunday. The 6th is a Sunday.
Okay.
It's on March 14th is the next session that we have scheduled. And that is, because on the 28th is work for me. The 7th we had, I don't know if David Millman is there. That was reserved to the synagogue calendar for a ritual committee meeting. So the next session is on the 14th. And I'm going to talk then about we're still looking in medieval Christianity, but then we're going to look at art and sculpture and the sculptures of the synagogue and the ecclesia and other visual representation of anti-Jewish visual representations in medieval Christian art. So that'll be the topic for that class, and I'll see you all then. If not
Okay,
before.
thank you very much. Thank you very much,
You're
Rabbi.
welcome.
Rabbi,
Bye.
make a
Bye.
comment.
Right.
Good night.
If we look at what happened on January 6th, and when one person could get up there and spew all sorts of lies, and how that could engage people to actually act in an irrational manner. Look at 1076 and Urban II and what he does, lying about the Saracens, saying things are totally untrue about the destruction of churches, which happened 50 years previous to that. And he was able to use that to gain ascendancy of political power, which he didn't have against the German nobles. And people bought into the great
Right.
lie. We have a
The great
parallel.
lie or the power of the pulpit. Yeah,
It's the same thing, isn't it?
that is true. Right, that potentially it is. That's right. That's right.
Okay, good night.
All right, good night,
Good night.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.